New ban list means an update to the top 10 decks of the format, going all the way from December into the new year of 2023 until we get the brand new core set of the Photon Hyperdrive in February. So, without further ado, we're going to dive straight in, head first to those top 10. Massive shout out to a host of players that I've been talking to who have kind of helped me get this top 10 list together, and I will explain each one on the list as best as I possibly can. So, we're going to dive straight first in at number 10. And number 10 is a deck that is just going to get stronger when we get the new set in February, and that is, of course, the Kashteras. And the Kashteras right now, Fenrir is being used as a engine card that will be put in most decks, but it really starts to shine. Now with the ban list allowing them to play free Dimension Fissure, on top of that, they could also play Macro Cosmo now at free if they wanted to. They're going to be a lot stronger. Right now, they're probably more of an anti-meta deck because they are missing the consistency cards that will come out when they get their brand new field spell, and of course a new monster that pretty much ticks everything over and allows them to start taking out those clunky cards and start putting in more consistency cards for the deck. Right now, it is going to be a technical anti-meta deck because being able to play Dimension Fissure, already main decking Dimension Shifter as well, will give them the edge on certain decks. Now, obviously, when you look at the top three that will be shown a little bit later on, one of them can absolutely lose to a D-Fissure and a Dimension Shifter, but when you start looking at number 2 and number 3, they can even play those cards themselves, meaning they really don't worry so much about them, so it doesn't give the Kashteras as much of an edge in that factor, but everything else will still allow them to play. Moving on to 9. Now this is another deck that has been around as an anti-meta deck and is still going to be very, very powerful and has got even stronger thanks to the ban list, and that is Exo Sisters. Now, again, with Exo Sisters, they do incredibly well in a tier Ishizu matchup because not only can they play D-Shifter, they can now play D-Fissure and, of course, Macro. They do naturally have a answer or a reaction to when stuff is moved in the graveyard, meaning that they can set themselves up with their boss monsters of quick play banishing, their trap cards of banishing as well, so they're not all just front row or all back row. They do have a nice balance of the two. The issue is, again, against the standard decks, against something that doesn't really heavily move anything in the graveyard or doesn't lose instantly to something like a D-Fissure or a Macro, they can still compete with the Exo Sisters themselves. Now, another additional bonus that the Exo Sisters got is technically they could go into Telenite Patelamaias, which did come back, meaning they do get access into Cyber Dragon Infinity. However, the issue is when they do something like that, they are sacrificing one of their strongest plays, and that is, of course, Exo Sister Martha, because she will lock you into Exo Sisters, meaning that you will only be able to go down a specific route. So it's not as big of a plus as it could be, but it's still a very interesting tech that the deck could play. Not to mention, if they really wanted to hold back, they could go directly into an Abyss Dweller, or they have their own natural archetype Abyss Dweller as well. But sadly, it is not like a quick effect, it's an on-summon effect, meaning that they have to go out of their way to summon it during their turn, to then use it as material to summon it off of the back of Magnifica during your opponent's turn. So it does give them ways of competing, but it does also give them a slight bit of a hiccup and a bit of a backtrack in order to kind of make it and do it themselves. Swifting in at number 8, we are going to be looking at Rika Sun Avalon. Now, I still highly rate this deck. I think it is incredibly powerful. The issue is it's kind of got a little bit weaker. It doesn't have as much representation as it did previously, and even then, it was still kind of one of them underdog decks that, even though it did win Euros and it did incredibly well at Nationals, getting second, it was a deck that still a lot of people overlooked. It had a great tier matchup because it was able to kind of tribute the cards off so they didn't trigger the effects into the graveyard, and obviously by triggering as cost as well was a great advantage for the deck. The issue is with the increase in D-Fissures and D-Shifters, being able to try and combat the Ishizu tier matchup, it has of course made it a little bit more difficult for the Sun Avalon deck to get going, and especially with the kind of decks that are being brought in to deal with Ishizu tier and everything else like that, they just have a stronger matchup naturally against the tier element, against the Rika Sun Avalon matchup. It still has a very good and powerful going first board and a good balance of going second. But again, like I said, it will have a really great matchup against tier Ishizu, but then it will struggle against the lower levels, which is why it's not further up the list. So number 7 on our list is the Naturia Ishizu deck. Now, the reason this has gone a little bit higher up is because I kind of wanted to not separate all the Ishizu decks. I didn't want to go, right, okay, well, number 7 is Ishizu this, and number 6 is Ishizu this. However, I feel that there are some standout versions and variants that utilize the Ishizus in more so than just milling absolutely everything, but giving themselves the ability to mill their own cards in the form of the Naturia in order to produce some very interactive and kind of powerful boards for their opponent to try and break. Now, I personally haven't had the pleasure of either facing this or building or playing this deck, but I have been able to watch a couple of the games where it has kind of come up a lot. And the reason that it's a lot better or stronger than the aforementioned decks on this list is the fact that it does have that ability to go against only the, of all the top decks. Like Ishizu Tiria does really well with all of the decks below it. It doesn't have a designated target. And what I mean by that is the Cash Tiras, if the deck doesn't care that it's facing, doesn't care about banishing, it's not going to do as well. Sun Avalon, if they don't mind being Tributor's Cost, or if they play cards that deal with the graveyard, then of course the Sun Avalon Reekers are going to start falling apart. The exact same with Exo Sisters, as great as they are. If a deck starts saying, well, I don't really care about banishing and I'm not going to move stuff from my graveyard, it then starts becoming an uphill battle for that deck. Whereas the Niteria Ishizu deck doesn't really have that much of a hindrance in regards to that, because it doesn't mind having its stuff milled by an Ishizu tier matchup. It also doesn't mind being locked out in certain scenarios because it has ways of being able to continue to play through them and continuing to be able to build boards and break boards through that kind of system as well. Moving on to number 6. Now, number 6 is Draco Slayers. Now, again, Draco Slayers have a very good kind of power play matchup because it kind of ticks all of the boxes. If it wanted to, it can become a control deck with its back row performances, but it just has huge consistency factors, and its main kind of go-to boss card in the form of the Ignister just has the absolute powerhouse of being able to shuffle cards back without destroying them, meaning it has a great ability to deal with an Ishizu tier matchup. It also has a great ability to kind of deal with a Barrier Statue lock play as well, because it does have access to really cool wind monsters and strong wind monsters that it can special summon. And then against a Sprite matchup or anything else like that, it can do very well. It also has, at this moment in time, a bit of a surprise factor because not a lot of people are prepared for it or can understand exactly what it does. So it still kind of determines that it's a little bit above Ishizu Niteria. It's above the rest again because it doesn't have a single gimmick or a single route of play that if decks above it start adapting or playing differently, it starts to struggle in that competitive matchup. So Draco Slayers are definitely getting in there just outside the top 5, and you'll understand a bit more when we get into the top 5 as to why that is. Now, before we get into the top 5, I'm just going to do some honourable mentions. Now, these are decks I feel that in the future could get stronger, or they're also decks that are a little bit sleeper that can do very, very well in the upcoming format, so that if you've already got them and you have been able to build them relatively cheaply, you could do incredibly well with them on top of that. So the first one is going to be, of course, Crystal Beasts. Now, Crystal Beasts have that amazing ability to play concave control. They also don't instantly lose against a macro, or more so instantly lose against a defissure as well. They could main deck shifter, so they do have that ability of utilising all of the cards that Konami have brought back to try and deal with an Ishizu tier matchup, and it already has a very decent matchup in regards to a Flunderies matchup because it doesn't need to wholeheartedly spam special summons, and being able to play stuff like Conclave and Heart gives them the ability to bounce troublesome cards or destroy troublesome cards with a nice array of back row cards, which I feel that control decks, stuff like Eldritch and everything like that, could do incredibly well in this format if you get the right hands and if you get the right matchups, but just not on a consistent basis to make it into a top 10. Another deck that I think could highly benefit from the banish changes is, of course, Gottis as well, which is the TCG exclusive. And the reason that deck can do incredibly well is, in theory, in certain variants, it could have already been main in D-Shifter. Macro isn't the end of the world if they play it as well. The big issue is that it does destroy stuff, but it needs to make sure that it banishes stuff as well, because then that can deal with an Ishizu tier matchup. It doesn't rely heavily on putting stuff in their graveyard, so it can dodge that play as well. The issue is it is all water, so a wind barrier statue will cause it a lot of issues to get going. And then some of its normal summon capabilities aren't as strong or as great as they would like to be. The one thing that Gottis do have that a lot of decks don't have is it gets to play both during their turn and your opponent's turn. So you basically set up your plays to start triggering and then going off during your opponent's turn, which again is why it's an honourable mention and not straight into the top 10. Another one to keep a mention of is something like Mathmex and, of course, Brigade. Now, Brigade obviously got Tenki back to 3. It also got the Rasalin, the Lyrillus Rasail Starlin back as well. Now, the fact that the deck has natural ways of searching DD Crow, it's also had a reprint of Utopic Draco Future, which is a great boss monster for them. The issue is, quite like Mathmex, which is why I've paired these two together, is they rely heavily on the graveyard. So at the start of this format, or at the start of this change of the ban list, I think a lot of people are going to be either main in D-Fissure or even side deck in D-Fissure, because I think it's such a good card that in theory, if you build your incredibly powerful board and then activate D-Fissure, it's kind of a way of having a spell version of a Floodgate. So it really does cause your opponent a lot of issues, especially with a lot of Ishizu tiers running around. The only issue with it being more of a side deck card than a main deck card is because it will feel something like Flunderies really don't care about D-Fissure. So it's a card you want to have the capability of not putting in at all, and that's where I feel your side deck's going to come into play to deal with the Flunderies matchup, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But regardless, I still think that, again, these are honourable mentions. I feel they just fall outside the top 10 because I don't feel that they can benefit specifically and directly with the returns on the ban list. But I also feel that they still gain capabilities in order to play and be underdog road decks that not a lot of people are going to instantly think of. But I still feel that they'll lose out to the majority of just single-played cards that are going to be highly represented in the upcoming format. So now getting back to our top 10 and going back in at number 5. So our 5th one is actually called Vims, but I probably want to call it Mivs. Now, Mivs is Madolche, Ishizu, Vernisylphs, and I think this deck is absolutely crazy. Now, as we know, Donald is our local Madolche player, and he does incredibly well with the deck. He built the deck to go pure OTK, go second, but I feel with the introduction of Vernisylphs, they've been able to go first a lot more consistently and set up more negates and protective boards. And then off the back of that, they also now have the ability to add the Ishizus in, because what you've got to keep in mind is technically the Ishizus are mainly, if not all, Earth and Fairies, and then that's the exact reason why the Vernisylphs work so well, because not only are they Fairies, but they are also Earth monsters, and they give you free summons. So where Madolches will usually play cards that lock themselves into Madolches, if they wanted to, and they wanted to kind of adapt it and change it a little bit more, as long as they only lock themselves into Earth monsters or only activating Earth monster effects at certain times, they can get access to any rank 4 that they possibly want. Not to mention the Madolche Tiramisu, the ability to just spin cards non-target is an incredibly powerful option to have in any deck, and the fact that it can do that against an Ishizu matchup, even a Flunderies matchup as well, as long as they're not locked under the barrier statue, is very important. They get an Omni-Negate in the form of the Vernisylph, so that gives them a more powerful go second boss monster or ability to protect their boards going forward. And it gives them a way to play around one of their biggest weaknesses, which is Nibiru, even though I expect Nibiru to be less represented in the upcoming format, because there are just the top decks, as I've already explained with Madolches. Everything else has the ability to play through a Nibiru or set up a negate before you get into the Nibiru window. So it does give them a couple of options to play around with it, and I honestly think that this could be a fun version to be keeping your eye out for, and it'll be interesting to see what Donald comes up with if he decides to go this route. I know he's definitely be playing the Madolche Vernisylph option. I don't know if he's going to add the Ishizus into it. If he does, it will be interesting to see what that can then do on a competitive scene, and I still feel that it just has the balance of everything it needs. It's got searchable back rows, which are pains in the backside to deal with. It's got recursion, it's good in the grind game, it's got natural OTK capabilities, and then when you add in the rest of the cards in, it's got extenders that let you play through multiple hand traps. It's got extenders that let you start even without a normal summon. The normal summons are insanely good. They can play D-Fissure and Dimension Shifter if they wanted to as a main or a side deck option. It's just absolutely crazy. It's one of them decks that's very tricky to go, okay, do I let it go first or do I go second? It's such a gamble and such a risk that unless you know how the opponent you're facing has built it, it's very difficult to do. So definitely watch out on that deck. It's one that you could even be worth picking up as well, especially trying to get all the pieces as cheap as you can. Even if you just went for Madolche Vernisylph, I still think it's very powerful. It may not deserve a top 5 spot as just Madolche Vernisylph, but it's still incredibly powerful. Moving on to number 4. Now, number 4 is more of like a variation than anything, because I didn't want to split them out into their own individual assets, but I wanted to kind of bring it together, and they are Bysteel variants. Now, I'm not talking about, hey, look, I'm playing a Shizu tier with a Bysteel engine. I'm talking about ones where the Bysteels actually synergize with the main deck itself, rather than a form of disruption for only your opponent. So when you look at the Bysteel variants, you've got to be looking at stuff like Branded Bysteel, incredibly powerful, being able to send Lubellion from deck directly to graveyard, and then being able to start bringing Lubellion back, set up your traps, set up your spells, draw power, pop power, you name it, you've got it. The biggest weakness to that is locking themselves into fusions. You then look at a more popular version right now, and that is of course Bysteel Thunder Dragons. Now Bysteel Thunder Dragons will get a massive boost thanks to Dimension Fissure and D-Shifter, so it's kind of like one of them counters to a counter already. So if you're up against a Flunder matchup and they go D-Shifter, you go, I don't care, Thunder Dragons banished, get me some materials, let's go! Yes, it is a bit tricky for the Bysteels themselves because they want to go to the graveyard, or they need Lights and Darks in the graveyard to banish to summon, but they still have ways to play around with it. On top of that as well, the Branded can still play under D-Fissure because you can just go Albion and start spinning the materials back, but it's something you don't really want to be heavily relying on. The other version of Bysteals is, of course, Bysteal Dragon Link. Now, I'm not going to talk about, like I said, the Bysteal Shizus, Bysteal Sprites, everything like that, because they'll come later on in the list. But I feel like the designated ones that utilise lights and darks and their own graveyards, with the Dragon Links being synchro-orientated and link-orientated, and then Thunder Dragons being pretty much everything orientated, and then of course the branded being fusion orientated. I think the deck's just incredibly powerful. I have a lot of fun with the Bysteals. I think they're a really cool engine, and it's very interesting to play around with it, because they're basically DD Crows as boss monsters, but where you lose the consistency of being able to banish anything to only lights and darks, you gain a boss monster on the board. So I think they're really cool, really fun, and I love playing with all the different variations of the deck, because it's very interesting to see. Moving into our top 3, and at number 3 we are going to be talking about Sprites. Now yes, you could be playing Runic Sprites, you can be playing Bysteal Sprites, you can be playing Pure Sprites, Toe Sprites, Life Tune Sprites, you name it. The reason this deck is up here is because it's one of them decks that really doesn't care too much about D-Shifter or D-Fissure. Now obviously, if they're playing the Toad engine, they're going to struggle a little bit more, especially if they want to play the Angler version as well. But I feel the deck has the capabilities to adapt. It also has the ability to side deck in those cards. It has huge amounts of consistency. Any normal summon level 2 and then just a handful of special summon level 2s is crazy. Even a normal summon of a level 2 that gets bounced or destroyed, so if they've got a starter, they just get to go off again. Gigantic Sprite and Sprite Elf are that powerful that we've actually seen them in decks outside of Sprites themselves. And of course, when you look at Elf, it's probably the most commonly used one, looking into tier elements as well. I think the deck is still incredibly powerful. I feel the fact that it can, if it wants to, be a control-orientated version using D-Fissure and D-Shifter, the fact that it can still produce the Toe Loop is absolutely insane. Yes, it's not on the same level it once was before it got Ronin Totem banned, but it is still incredibly powerful. That still gives them a matchup above the rest of everything below it, but its main struggles will be the next 2 that I will be reading off, and that is, of course, going into number 2. And number 2 will be that all-annoying Flunderies. Now, Flunderies' biggest weakness, believe it or not, is probably itself. The deck loses to itself more times than not because of the capabilities of being bricked. However, the deck itself, when it goes off, is near impossible to stop. The fact that they can set up their own versions of chain blocks, with Advent, they've got ways of being able to dodge certain hand traps. They've also got ways of being able to play through certain hand traps and continue to make their plays thereon. Which is why I feel that something like Draw and Lockbird will see itself come back into the side deck format, because Map is an incredibly powerful field spell. M-Pen as a walking, talking bit of a floodgate can be a pain in the backside as well, alongside your Barrier Statue of the Winds, Explored Winds themselves. They also have the Harpy trap card that basically says no play for your opponent. And then they also have a trap card, Dreaming Town, that lets them summon multiple times during your turn. Annoying as if that is. And then they also get a spell card that lets them tribute your stuff. Just not monsters, but any of your stuff for their summons. It's absolutely insane. The biggest weakness of the deck is if they don't open up well enough, they can get stopped, but they're still able to play Prosperity. They can play D-Fissure, D-Shifter, Riser as a bounce card as well. They've got so many options. It sometimes amazes me how they do brick, but when they do, you will more times than not lose the game, but when they don't, and if you get on a consistent one of not bricking, it is incredibly powerful. It has one of the best matchups against the Shizu tier as well. It doesn't care about banishing, so all of those decks that are going to be bringing in their banish equivalents to deal with the Shizu tier, Flunders just stand there and go, I don't care, do what you want, set me up, that's all I need. So it's a very, very powerful deck. It is an incredibly annoying deck, however, it is basically right now the counter opposite to the number 1 deck, and counter opposite to what I still recommend and still believe is the best deck, and that is a Shizu tier. The fact that this deck plays both during just as long during their turn as they do during your turn is absolutely insane. They have a hand trap that helps get them going, so even if they're going second, they still have ways of being able to build a stronger board than you, unbelievably, during your first turn. Like what? They also have access to all of the powerful fusion monsters. They don't lock themselves directly into fusions. They still have access to XYZs. They still have access to be able to even build their own counter to the mirror match in the form of Abyss Dweller. You add that with the Ishizus, which allow them to mill even more cards, increasing their consistency as much as possible, and then looping back their cards from their graveyard to the main deck so that they never really deck out. The deck is absolutely crazy. It's insane. The consistency levels are through the roof. Yes, they lost Herald of the Orange Light, which was a very good counter to something like D-Shifter or any particular power play card that would have caused them an issue, and a lot of the anti-meta decks and even Flunderies decks were able to now get D-Fissure and D-Shifter and even Macrocosmo, but I still feel the deck will be naturally prepared to be dealing with stuff like that in the forms of Heartbeat, to be able to deal with the back row. It's just absolutely insane. Yes, if you see a D-fissure, you're probably going to go scoop, let's go. But you still have natural ways in the main deck to out it. And then in your side deck, that's where you'll start to focus a bit more on it. Maybe going for anti-spells, maybe being able to go for more plays to kind of deal with it. The biggest issue is, of course, D-fissure, because it is a spell that can be used during turn 0 or, of course, during turn 2, depending on whether... So if I'm going second against them, I can activate D-fissure, and it means it kind of slows down their ability to fuse during my turn. But then also going first, after I've built my board, I can add that on top as an extra grain of protection. So unless they open up a route to pop it or deal with it, most of their monsters are going to get banished and not be able to trigger their effects. Anyway, that was my whole top 10 list. I hope I provided you with enough explanation as possible to each individual one of those decks on the list. Let me know what you think of the top 10. Let me know what your top 10 is. Obviously, this is all down to personal preference. A lot of people were changing a couple of things. I think the only kind of thing that was set in stone was near enough the top 1. Even between the top 2 and 3, some people were like, well, Sprites are more consistent, but Flunderies are stronger, like which one goes which. And ultimately, I went down to the whole fact of, it really depends. Like, if you have a bad day with Flunderies, you will brick like no tomorrow and you will lose. If you have a good day with Flunderies, you're probably going to absolutely dominate, because it is just such a very simplistic deck to make. And it's very cheap to make as well, and is very powerful against the current meta. And even the anti-meta decks, it has a very nice balance between everything, which is what makes Tears and Sprites so good as well, is it has a very nice balanced level against all of the other decks around it, which is why they do solidify the top 3 in my opinion. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share. Till next time, as absolutely always, guys, stay safe, and of course, happy dueling.